What's going on, guys? I'm Dr. Downey, and today we are going to discuss how to protect your heart on cycle or while cruising, just using any exogenous steroid. And just a note, this is for people using steroids, whether it be cruising or blasting, and not necessarily for the general public. Because some of these recommendations could be harmful if you are not using steroids. Or not harmful, just unnecessary. So let's get on with the presentation. So this is a follow-up to my kidney protection video, and this was requested, so I thought I'd do it. This is about the heart in particular, and not about cholesterol. That will be a different video. So this is just a quick guide to heart health on cycle by Dr. Downey. And as always, the objectives are your mama. And let's get on to the first topic of discussion, and that is obviously your blood pressure, because if your blood pressure is running high, your left ventricle has to deal with a higher afterload. And what that means is it has to pump harder against your high blood pressure in order to maintain adequate blood flow to the rest of the body. This results in thickening of the ventricle in order to compensate for this, and over time it may become dysfunctional. Essentially it's functional at the beginning, but it may become so thick that it becomes dysfunctional, and it affects the rest of the heart by leading to higher pressures in the ventricle itself and a higher ejection or lower ejection fraction, which spills over to the atrium, which is above the ventricle. That spills over into the lungs, leading to high pulmonary pressures, and then the right side of the heart. So it's important to control it, since it does lead to an enlarged heart. So obviously we have our first line, which includes lifestyle measures, but you'll see at the bottom of first line I added ACE inhibitors and ARBs. And that is for an important reason. So for cardio, you should be doing your cardio. WHO recommendation is 150 minutes a week. I suggest at least low intensity steady state cardio. Your salt intake should be reduced. If this kind of depends on your ethnicity, but for example, if Africans have higher salt intakes, they tend to have higher blood pressures. Your diet, you should increase your fiber intake as well as reduce saturated fats and just processed food, because that tends to be higher in sodium and unnecessary preservatives and such. So ACE inhibitors and ARBs are actually first line. This is a bit odd because medications tend to not be first line, especially in terms of blood pressure, but this is for people on cycle or cruising. The problem is, if you're cruising or on cycle, your exogenous androgens do upregulate things like aldosterone and angiotensin II, which lead to cardiac enlargement, fibrosis, and myocardial inflammation, things like that. So, and not only that, obviously, it leads to an increased blood pressure, because high aldosterone leads to an increased blood pressure. So it is important for you to have ARBs, because even if you don't have a high blood pressure, these hormones may still be upregulated. So it's important to control them. So I would actually suggest most people on steroids take it prophylactically, an ACE inhibitor or an ARB, obviously through a doctor and screening, with past medical health and other health issues you have. But obviously if you have health issues and you can't run an ARB, I don't know why you'd be running steroids to begin with. Unless it's TRT, but in that case maybe you won't need an ARB. That's up to your treating physician. So second line is if your blood pressure isn't controlled by the first line, ARB or ACE inhibitors, which they tend not to be, especially in African individuals, then you'd want to add like a thiazide diuretic. Calcium channel blockers also tend to work well. Perhaps those can be beta blockers, things like that. So I put Cialis pre-workout here, and this is more hypothetical. But essentially, if you're doing something like squatting, any or high loads, during your workout, your blood pressure spikes, and those can accumulate, those spikes in blood pressure, and that can also lead to damage of your kidneys or possible damage. So it's best if you do have strenuous workouts where your blood pressures do elevate to quite high levels, you'll see in some competitors in powerlifting meets where their vessel in their nose bursts or something. That's the type of high blood pressure I mean, and it's best to take Cialis pre-workout because it works quite quickly and it will reduce that those blood pressure spikes. Next topic for discussion is your heart rate. So I made many videos on this, but this is just a summary. So it's called tachycardia-induced cardiomyopathy, essentially high heart rate induced cardiac or heart problem, essentially. So the important thing is to get your baseline heart rate when you're not on cycle and compare it to when you are on cycle. Because although guidelines may say it's above 100, that for you, your normal heart rate might be 60, and then when you're on cycle, it's 80 or 90, that's quite high for you if your normal heart rate is 60 and can potentially, it's not directly linked, but it could lead to this problem. So the treatment for this would be obviously avoiding compounds that would stimulate high heart rates, such as fat burners and things like that, and tren, but you could essentially treat it with low intensity steady state cardio. But it's best to probably, if you're on steroids, add pharmacological management, because lifestyle measures are not that great when it comes to you, especially if you're blasting. So a beta blocker, they're possibly post-workout, but you could take it during the day. It kind of enhances that ability of your body to go from a sympathetic to a parasympathetic response, and the reason they thought possibly post-workout is so that your body after a workout isn't in that sympathetic state for longer than it has to be, because obviously when you're working out, your blood pressure and your heart rate increase. So the question of which beta blocker, there are many different types of non-selective, selective. A lot of people have spoken about nebivolol, and the reason for that is it's quite selective, so you won't get the side effects with something that isn't selective, like a propranolol, where you not only do you get the decreased heart rate, but you also just get sluggish and your metabolic rate decreases a bit, whereas nebivolol seems to maintain your basal metabolic rate, as well as it doesn't hinder your performance in the gym, which beta blockers can do. So another topic, I'm coming out with another video on this, but it's essentially inflammation of the heart, which kind of links back to the whole ARB, ACE inhibitor, myocardial fibrosis thing, but essentially they found focal myocarditis to be quite common in rats with high dose testosterone. So this would suggest that individuals using high doses or blasting would need some sort of protection from this inflammation or myocarditis. And that it's called focal myocarditis because they didn't find it widespread in the heart. It only seemed to affect focal or single areas. And they postulate that it could be deoxycorticosterone mediated, which is a precursor to aldosterone. So it's that whole interplay there, and ACE inhibitors and ARBs have been shown to decrease deoxycorticosterone levels, especially when they gave rats the deoxycorticosterone salts, and it was shown that the ACE inhibitors and ARBs were actually able to reduce the effect that these salts had on the rats. So I mentioned antioxidants. There are many antioxidants, but surprisingly, I've mentioned it before, but melatonin in anabolic androgenic steroid users seems to be fairly cardioprotective in terms of it being a potent antioxidant. So this actually overlaps into the next video, which will be about blood lipids, because it prevents the LDL oxidation or peroxidation. So it could be useful in preventing just an inflammatory response in the heart also. So then I mentioned supplements or other, just because I don't have enough evidence yet, but I will do to recommend them as staples. But Your ubiquinol, which you can buy over the counter, seems to be very cardioprotective, not only from a lipid standpoint, but just overall ejection fraction and cardiac output. Cardarine, although it does, this is I'm mixed about because I still haven't come to a consensus on cardarine, but so far I'm leaning towards not being in favor of it, but that may change. But it does show to, since it's a PPAR agonist, it does show to improve cardiac function. Not only that, it improves your lipids and things like that. So your SGLT2 inhibitors, those have also shown to help a lot with cardiovascular mortality. These studies were done. I haven't done enough research yet to recommend or not recommend them, but it's the same with metformin. They only seem to be beneficial in metabolic diseases. So if you do have a metabolic disease, high blood pressure, insulin resistance, things like that, then these would be beneficial in terms of cardiovascular mortality. Metformin, although the meta-analysis on it for non-diabetic patients was a bit mixed. They said it didn't decrease the incidence of cardiovascular events, but it did, however, decrease all-cause mortality and cardiovascular mortality. So it could be useful, but that's more in, I would say it has more of a place in metabolic disease. So that's, and obviously, the last slide, you need an ARB if you're on cycle, just because of all of that pathway is upregulated and has been linked to many problems steroid users have. So if you have any questions, let me know what you think. Comment for the sake of the algorithm if you'd like to, subscribe, and just, yeah, let me know what you think. Thank you for watching.